Spectabilis, dear Volker Kronenberg, dear friends and supporters of law as culture, dear presenters. Let me welcome all of you on behalf of the Käte Hamburger Center in the Humanities, Law as Culture. It is no matter of course that so many people from all over the world are coming together today and tomorrow and getting involved in this sometimes rather strenuous format of an online conference. And it is by no means a matter, of course, that you, dear Dean, take the time to welcome the auditorium as busy as you are. You have already played a major role in helping us to find this wonderful location directly on the banks of the River Rhine, where the House of Legal Cultures is situated. Here we would meet normally in the Max Weber lecture hall and afterwards refresh ourselves in the Durkheim Salon if we were not in pandemic times. Some of you know the place, most of you. The fact that you are opening this conference today, dear Volker Kronenberg, is an expression of the support that you and the University of Bonn give to cutting-edge research. This is one of the reasons why we can call ourselves a university of excellence, have 6 clusters of excellence, and perhaps even succeed in making the academic community in Bonn and scientists from all over the world another offer in the future, namely to launch a further center for advanced study, the Bonner Wissenschaftskolleg. Dean Kronenberg and I are working on this together in conjunction with other people and the rectorate, and it may be realized as I see it in a foreseeable future, as I hope. But what is it all about today and tomorrow? In a single sentence, I will try to resume and then pursue in more detail. On the one hand, we want to unfold the sometimes ambivalent concept of Gemeinschaft from its theoretical history and with the help of a theory of multiple communities in social modernity, trace its contemporary phenomena, such as pandemic community building, digital community structures, and communities with nature. In each case, we will ask ourselves whether we are dealing with a normativity of its own that is demanded or even produced by the inner logic of community. But before going deeper into further details, I'll pass the imaginary microphone to Dean Kronenberg. The floor is yours. And once again, thank you very much for being with us and for all your support.
Thank you very much. Dear Werner, Gephart, Daniel Witte, distinguished guests and participants, dear colleagues. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all on behalf of the Faculty of Arts to this international online conference, Humanities and their Law by the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture. Since 2010, the Käte Hamburger Center in the Humanities has been dedicated to multi-dimensional legal analysis with a focus on the cultural dimension of law and, in recent years, in particular on the interactions between the juridical and other social spheres, such as politics, the economy, or, as in the case today and tomorrow, the community. The conference pursues the goal of addressing the multi-layered connections between law and community and inquiring about their possible relevance regarding urgent questions of our contemporary societies. Consequently, you are dealing today with the theoretical background of the unification of community and the socialization of communities, while tomorrow you will engage in interesting case studies and new forms of community that are significantly influenced by current phases of crisis and transformation. Within this context, I find it particularly exciting that you will, for example, address the question whether we should apply our idea of community and communality to nature, and especially against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. The question rightly arises as to what new experiences we have gained as a global pandemic community of the modern age and how these influence our sense of community. In these times, when contacts were reduced to a minimum, the central social position of the smallest human community, the family, once again became apparent. But we all also garnered new experiences with the digital networked form of community, whether through video conferencing or social networks, which became more important for many people. A close look at the program for this conference reveals that it has been possible to attract many researchers from different countries to this topic. The impressive tableau of speakers, some from Germany and France, but also from Poland, Italy, Great Britain, Israel, Hong Kong, India, and even Nigeria, promises an immensely fruitful conference. In my capacity as Dean of Faculty of Arts, it is always a special concern of mine to promote and welcome not only interdisciplinarity, but also the internationality of our research. Thus, this event contributes to these efforts in an almost ideal way. As we seek to strengthen and intensify the international networking of our researchers, even if only in a digital environment for the time being. Time and again, I have the pleasure of witnessing how consciously adopting the perspective of colleagues from other countries enriches our scientific work. Different cultural and scientific historical influences always cast a different, usually illuminating light on things that we actually think we already know. You should therefore also benefit from the many different perspectives presented here today and tomorrow. Before I end my introductory remarks, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Professor Werner Gephart and Dr. Daniel Witte for organizing this wonderful conference and for their devoted, extremely worthwhile and inspiring work at the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, Law as Culture. Distinguished guests, I wish you good, insightful discussions, a fruitful scientific exchange, and a good collaboration today as well as tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Normally we would applaud and it would be some sounds at least in the background, and I want to do that at least because there are a lot of reasons to do that, because as I was very sure in advance that you would not just give a formal invitation, a formal presentation, and a formal welcome, but you go always into the content. And that is why I really regret for 2 minutes that you are not free to be invited as a fellow to our center, but that you have to do your obligations as Dean of our faculty. What a pleasure to see how deep you are in the matters that we are dealing with during the next days. Once again, thank you very much for this very, very, very kind introduction and opening.
You're welcome.
And a lot of things have been said, and I will repeat. So I should completely change my introduction, but we will see and we'll arrange with one another as a whole. And I might remind you that the second phase of the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture was inspired by social theory and guided by the assumption that law should be read as part of the society's culture, set out to both systematically and historically comparatively relate law to economy, as Dean Kronenberg had said before, politics and the community. That is to say, to want to comprehensively see the law's overall social significance, seine soziale und sinnhafte Bedeutung. References to the economic sphere are evident. Economy and the orders are Weberian formulations for their principled relationship, which is examined in Weber's so-called Rechtssoziologie, using its historical development as conditions for the development of law. The relationship between the legal and political spheres has occupied us, not least during the corona pandemic. Public law, and in particular, constitutional law and its legal, cultural, and constitutional cultural manifestations provide the material in which this relationship manifests itself. With the analytical concepts of economy and politics, world systems and social spheres are named, covering a wide field of social analysis. But in doing so, plethora of phenomena are often ignored. Circles of friends, family associations, sports clubs, voluntarian associations, or even coercive communities like the mafia, places where overall social and particularistic solidarity, as opposed to scarce goods or political decision-making, is produced. Places of mechanical solidarity, or a solidarité par similitude, as Durkheim named it in The Division of Labor and Society. Even Weber, who is rather sober in his feelings on solidarity, played with the concepts of a Einverständnisgemeinschaft and processes of Vergemeinschaftung, communization, if one can say it in English like this, in order to counteract an essentialist interpretation of the juxtaposition of community and society, of Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, as he thought he'd find it in Ferdinand Tönnies, though I think they are analytical categories in Tönnies, but also sometimes it is ambiguous in his writings, as we will see later on. The communal dream appears again and again, whether at Monteverdi in residential communities, the retreat to small towns, for example, during the pandemic, the discovery of communal shares in the internet as a digital community, or in the search for a lost nature, to rediscover it is a community of society as a kind of a community of society and nature. Admittedly, the strongest community images are tied to times of crisis. This is very clear. To communities of need, communities of fate, as they arise in times of war, for example. We are never sure whether we take a dream at face value, or if in the course of fictional realism, we have a large project about fictions and realities at our Faculty of Art, by the way, for those who are not familiar with these projects. And this is interesting to see it in the Weberian and other writings of that time. We are theoretically overwhelmed by the significance of the fictions of community, or if we succumb to an ideological community of brother nations, of abolished class relations, and similar communitarian deceptions in the end. Therefore, it is not surprising if this dimension of social life is repeatedly viewed with suspicion. Does it not lead us off the icy path of dissecting the structures and dynamics of society and into the backwards realm of romantic pre-modern longings if we still use the community semantics in order to describe modern societies? After having identified hundreds of meanings of community, and this has been a discussion during the last month at our center, similar to the concept of culture, it is not better with culture. One must be aware of the ambivalence of the idea of community and its practices from the very beginning, especially when deciding to utter the term. But let me say this in brackets, but isn't dealing with ambiguities of meaning precisely the point of cultural studies? Should it not be applicable to its own basic concepts, namely contextualization, historical embedding, systematization, systematische Verfremdung, etc.? Bracket close. But how are community and law related? Weber speaks, for example, of religious communities, which is also the title of his systematic so-called Religionssoziologie. That's the correct title in the historical and critical edition. But there are also political community forms which range from parties to factions to the imagined community of the nation, or even aim at the political world community. Weber, however, does not speak of legal communities, but of coercive apparatus of, or an ideal community of consent, the members of which mutually presume to act as if they were guided by a jointly shared normative order. Once again, this fictional element. But how can we tell whether we are dealing with a political, religious, or scientific community, such as the German research foundation called Forschungsgemeinschaft und nicht Forschungsgesellschaft? By the subjectively meant significance, subjektiv gemeinter Sinn of the actors to provide meaning, to associate political power, or does it help us further to understand their respective normative order? Is law, in the end, something like the DNA of communities? Like to know what you think about that, Robert, Gottfried, and Leon, and others who entered meanwhile, Marie-Claire Faublaise, and others. This conference program is not immodest. In the first block, we wish to explore the interactions of law and community from a theoretical perspective. This is necessary. The legacy of sociological romanticism is at the beginning of this attempt to make theoretical history fruitful. And Ferdinand Tönnies has stood for this since his groundbreaking piece in Sociology, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. Niall Bond will enlighten us about this with his special knowledge and from a certain background. While Émile Durkheim refers to this work, his ideas of solidarité mécanique and solidarité organique go in different directions, which is definitely influenced by the German tradition. In contrast, Weber is concerned with deconstructing the concept of community, dissolving it into individual acts and seeking the effectiveness of community in its fictionality, as I said before, whether in the concept of agreement or in the belief in community or communality, as I would say, Gemeinsamkeitsglaube, a fantastic idea, I would say, explicitly naming the imaginative belief. I'm particularly pleased to have gained a companion for this topic who has never let himself be deterred by Weber and Durkheim's supposed incompatibility and pursued both classics with equal intensity, namely Hans-Peter Müller. In contrast, Parsons, who did his debt of gratitude to Tönnies in a brief note but substantially resurrects it in the pattern variables, seems less sophisticated insofar. Admittedly, he made a far-reaching theoretical offer to analytically explore a separate social subsystem alongside culture, polity, and economy, which he calls societal community. Is this the place of inclusion, of integration, or even of the formation of law, as we can read Parsons, who has the greatest difficulty in locating law, by the way, in its systemic structure? Giuseppe Shortino from Trento, where I presented by chance for the first time my own reflections on the convergence of solidarité sociale and belief in communality, will take on this task as a proven expert on Volker Parsons, what he is. But what does it mean, both norm-theoretically and for legal practice, that we do not live in just one community, for instance, a family, which, as we know, is becoming more complicated to be reduced to a single family form, a circle of friends, a professional association, a political community, a religious community, and even a world community. What does it mean to belong to several communities, and how are they assigned to each other, hierarchically, concentrically, equally, etc.? And what does this mean for the character of their normative orders and the conflicts between multiple affiliations? Marie-Claire Faublès, meanwhile, having entered the scene from the Max Planck Institute in Halle, will reflect on this from the perspective of legal anthropology. While Leo Warschak, also present on the screen from the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, will expound on Hannah Arendt's theory of law. We are particularly curious to see how an author who discovered communal forces in the shadow of Dionysus and saw in the Age of Tribes autant des tribus, a sign of our time, will interpret the power of the communal ideal as puissance de l'idéal communautaire, namely Michel Maffesoli, who for many years held the former chairship of Emil Durkheim at Sorbonne. While a vitalistic moment in the understanding of community shines through here, a praxeological understanding raises the question of the normativity that stems from communal action in the first place, according to Christoph Schelke. Thus, multicultural society would also have to emerge from such a permanent communicative practice and its networks, which does not see multiple affiliations as a waving error of or disturbance to modern societies, but rather as their building principle. Roger Cottrell from London, who can be regarded as a representative of a community theory of law, I would say, will present his research on this topic on the basis of a wonderful paper he had written for this occasion, for this conference. How is community experienced in the digital age, and what kind of trans-local community is in the making? These questions will be explored by the Italian philosopher Maurizio Ferraris, who has dealt with the quality of social relations from a philosophical point of view, from iPads to social media, culminating in the monumental work Humanities that came out this year. The preconditions is that the limits of community or to community, the title of Helmut Plessner's dissertation, written in Bonn in 1922, can be overcome in the first place, which Marta Buchholz from Warsaw, the former professor at our center, will deal with systematically. This prepares us for examining the connection between ideally condensed communities and their own normativity in ancient Israel, in Islam, according to Raja Sakhani, with regard to the constitution of Medina, in ancient and new China, according to Helen Han Peng, or in the prime example of a universalistic societal community in the United States. Sabine Meyer will report on this using the example of Native American status. Finally, we cannot forget the example of India, which has become a lesson of diversity for us, so that not without reason, numerous social science debates have been initiated from the Indian continent. Anakoti Finda is equally at home in Mumbai, and the Eifel will tell us an Indian German as an Indian Germanist and poet about this Indian miracle. And I've seen her on the screen. She is with us, and you should not miss her. The last panel also wants to show you communitarian diversity and not the swamp of community, even if you have, of course, studied the program carefully. But the verbatim explanation perhaps makes the connectedness, as I hope, of the topics even clearer for all of us who face the adventure of a 2-day conference in Zoom format. I hope we will survive and you are in good health, and so the medical care system around you is working well, etc. And this brings us to the last round of discussion. It poses a special challenge, namely to apply coagulated knowledge about community dynamics to today's societal challenges. This applies to the European community, where some of you have left us, unfortunately, which already bears the community problem of solidarity and shared burden in its name, what has become just the problem. Matthias Herding, an internationally renowned connoisseur in international and European law, who, by the way, transformed into a Durkheimian during his stay at the center, he will cover this perspective. A very different type of community building is observed in Stefano Osella's trans community, which the European community recently stepped up to protect by strongly rejecting discrimination acts by Orban's Hungarian government. Even if we have compensated the fictional encounter of Durkheim and Weber on the flyer, and the original is behind me, and I could show it later on if somebody is interested to have more details, wearing the masks, as you have seen on the folder of the invitation card. The collective experience of the pandemic gives reason to think about communitarian solutions to the crisis. Greta Olsen, a cultural scientist and Americanist, is particularly attached to the center and will build a bridge linking minority communities to the global pandemic community. Community demands of a new kind arise where we have detached ourselves from the arrogant anthropocentric worldview and include creation, the cosmos, and nature in broader sense. What problems of normativity do we face when we grant stones, rivers, and mountains their own rights and find ourselves in a new sociality that transcends the human community? A passionate Kelsian and sociologist of law and juridico-ecologist, namely Pierre Brunet of Paris 1, will share his thoughts and research with us. So this is the program through which I would again like to consider the systematic questions of communal normativity. I have written down 6 questions. Can we identify characteristics of, first one question I have, of communal norm formation and application that distinguish them from normative programs of other social units? Second, do cultural factors play a role here? From, let me say, in a Weberian way, if you want to say that, from traditional to rational or charismatic communities? Third, how are communal normativities interlaced with each other? Fourth, does the community building effect legitimize the normative order? Does it make sense to speak, so to say, of a community culture of validity? Fifth point, how can we overcome the paradoxes of community formation, the validity of which lies in its effervescent binding forces, normative forces, which at the same time tend to monitor its members and to exclude the other? This two sides of community is still fascinating. Sixth question, is it the normative order that makes the difference between religious, political communities, pandemic, ecological risk communities, friendship circles, charismatic artists, or internet communities, etc., etc.? These are just a few of the questions that we are confronted with under different names in the discourse on collective identities, deliberative models of democratic norm building or centralist norm usurpation, the ambivalence of manageable communities as a context of emergency and terror, the illusion of community invocation, which is only suitable to conceal inequalities. There is no question that we are at the center of thinking about and shaping sociality. As the pandemic has taught us, the need of being surrounded by communal feelings and sentiments. Less sentimental, Daniel Witte will add some further theoretical reflections and also explain how we should use the Zoom format for the sake of our conference. It's your turn, Daniel Witte. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dear participants, on behalf of the Center, I would also like to welcome you to our conference, and I'm very delighted that so many of you have joined us for the 2 days of discussion on the relations between community and law. I cannot and I do not want to add much to Werner Gephart's rich introduction, but perhaps I would like to highlight 3 points, or tensions rather, that make the concept of community, especially from the perspective of sociological theory, iridescent and therefore interesting to me. The first tension concerns the history of theory, of course. We heard about that already. Community is often juxtaposed with society here, thus initially representing a category for describing pre-modern social formations. In this reading, the concept of community quickly acquires an overly emphatic flavor that always also points to dark chapters in the history of its use and misuse, and to a dimension of the narrowness of social ties and of social radicalism, as Plessner put it in his Limits of Community. In this respect, the concept of community stands for much of what modernity once promised to free us from. At the same time, however, it still has an obvious analytical potential for the present, because society seemingly cannot do without some form of we feelings and fictions or insinuations of communality. In addition, references to community can also be found again and again in the material object field of sociology itself. That is, real actors of modern society continuously refer to this idea, even if we must not hastily confuse these uses of the term with our own scientific notions, of course. And yet, other terms have come to the fore in sociological discourse, each of which denotes something similar to, but none of which denotes exactly the same thing as community. Collectives, for example, milieus even, neo-tribal structures, as we know not least from Michel Maffesoli. At the same time, the very concept of society seems in many places to be losing plausibility, which makes the discussion even more difficult. Secondly, conceptually and systematically, community always refers to an inescapable tension. Werner Gephart already pointed to this fact, between inclusion and exclusion, as Martha Buchholz, for instance, will perhaps remind us again. But also to the necessity of always thinking of communities in the plural and in their simultaneity, and perhaps at the same time under conditions of globality and modern forms of communication, of applying an expanded understanding of community. In turn, this is opposed by the well-founded fear that the meaning of the term is sharp precisely when it is used rather restrictively and is related to clearly contoured social figurations, or vice versa, that its content and also its analytical potential diminishes with its expansion, so that in the extreme case, the world community remains as an empty conceptual shell without substantial content. And thirdly, there is perhaps also a tension between theorizing and empirical research here, because we have a considerable problem in applying such a highly analytical concept as community to empirical realities, a concept that also refers so strongly to ideal conceptions, to fictions, and poorly tangible entities. Here, questions of operationalization also arise, of the relation between analytical category and object, and of the sociological projection also of concepts onto a reality that seeks to permanently elude this. Last but not least, there is always, of course, the question of law. Narrowed to positive state law, another tension quickly arises here as well, namely that between a consolidated law and a multiplicity of communities, if one does not want to take refuge hastily in rhetorical formulas of the legal community, whatever that shall be. On the other hand, there is a long tradition of sociology of law that does not narrow law in precisely this way, but seeks the sources and the location of law precisely in the social associations that often precede or transcend the state in social relations, groups, and communities. For one of the central fathers of this perspective, Eugen Ehrlich, it is therefore true, and I quote from the Fundamental Principles of the Sociology of Law from 1913, that the inner order of the associations of human beings is not only the original, but also, down to the present time, the basic form of law. And in fact, all these associations, whether they are organized or unorganized, and whether they are called country, home, residence, religious communion, family, circle of friends, social life, political party, industrial association, or goodwill of a business, make certain demands in exchange for that which they give. And the social norms which prevail in these communities are nothing more than the universally valid precipitate of the claims which the latter make upon the individual. End of quote. I will leave it with this quotation on community, maybe as the DNA of law, which it should also be noted is central to the design of an entire tradition of the sociology of law. And I really look forward to exploring with you together these tensions outlined here, very briefly, as well as many others, of course. And with that, I will return the floor to Werner Gephart, who will introduce you to our first speakers in panel 1, the juridification of community and the societalization of law. Thank you very much.